Hello, Colton here with Tech for an unboxing and quick overview of the Samsung 960 Evo M.2 NVMe SSD, more commonly referred to as the 960 Evo. Alright, let's start with a quick overview of what's on the box. Pretty simple packaging. You get a picture of what the actual SSD looks like on the front. The model we're opening up right now is the 500 gig model. This comes in 250, 500, and 1 terabyte models. All of them have very good performance. Performance does scale with capacity a bit, so the 1 terabyte is going to be the highest performing, with the 500 gig being the medium performing model, and the 250 gig on the lowest performing. All of these pretty much kill the performance of any other SSD on the market. We'll get into that a little bit later though. Coming around to the back, you have a brief overview of some of the specs and a note of the 3-year limited warranty. And that's about it for the packaging, so let's open it up. Alright, inside the box we just have a simple little plastic case that holds the SSD. We have your installation guide and user manual here, as well as the warranty statement. Below that, there's the SSD. You can see by comparison to a standard X-Acto blade that this is a very tiny part. This is the standard M.2 form factor. The labeling is pretty simple. It just has the product name, part number, serial numbers, and other related information. On the back you have your usual FCC and similar warnings, and that's about it. So let's take a look at performance. This SSD did extremely well in all of our performance tests. Of particular note is the fact that it does well even at very low Q depths. Not as well as Intel's Optane memory, but that is in a whole nother price point and is much more designed to display system memory rather than your primary storage. Even at a Q depth of 1, for sequential throughput, we got about 1500 megabytes a second for write and about 2000 megabytes a second for read, which is extremely impressive for a consumer level SSD. This really is faster than most enterprise SSDs at this point. As with most SSDs, as you ramp up the Q depth, the throughput does increase. It gets up to about 3000 megabytes read and 2000 and a little below 2000 megabytes write. It reaches the maximum write speed at about a Q depth of 2, and the maximum read speed is reached at a Q depth of 8. There's a fairly low Q depths for reaching your maximum throughput, which is really nice to see because in almost all circumstances, even under pretty heavy usage, you're going to be at Q depth 1 or 2, maybe up to 4 most of the time. You almost never see 8 and above, so at just a Q depth of 2, you're hitting your maximum write speeds, and your read speeds never really drop below about 2000 megabytes a second. And that is megabytes, not megabits. Now, getting to the random read-write performance. As with most SSDs, you see a greater change from low to high Q depth in your random performance, but it's still quite impressive with this drive. Starting off at a minimum Q depth of 1, our read performance is about 20,000 IOPS, write performance is about 50,000 IOPS. That ramps up to about 350,000 IOPS on the right side, that's at a Q depth of about 8, and up to the same 350,000 IOPS for read, although it takes a Q depth of 64 to reach that maximum. On your random, you do often sit at higher Q depths than on your sequential reads and writes, so you are going to be sitting higher than 1 a lot of the time when you're hitting this pretty hard with random reads and writes, and those IOP numbers that we're seeing for this drive are pretty much off the charts compared to any other SSD, and I'm including both SATA and other NVMe SSDs in that comparison. Now, one other thing to look at with any SSD is when you're hitting the cache, particularly the write cache, versus when you're going straight to the MLC flash. On reads, you're really almost never reading off of the cache, and it doesn't make much of a difference, so we don't really need to look at that. But when we talk about writes, anything you write to the SSD before your cache is full is going to be going to your write cache, which is a higher write speed than most of the flash. And then if you manage to fill that up, you'll go to writing straight to the flash. Now on these SSDs, the write cache varies in size depending on the capacity of the drive. It ranges from 13 gigabytes for the 250 gigabyte model up to 42 gigabyte cache for the 1 terabyte model. Now keep in mind, you can write much more than that to the SSD before you fill the cache. That's because as you write to the cache is also emptying to the rest of the flash. And with these drives, even the TLC flash is so fast that it is very difficult to fill up that cache. Now, with that in mind, your write speeds to the cache are about 1,800 megabytes per second, and once you're out of the flash, they're a little bit over 1,000 megabytes a second. Now, both those numbers are very impressive, and again, it is very rare that you will not be writing to the flash. You basically have to be transferring large files from another one of these same drives to ever fill up that cache. Even if you're transferring large files from a SATA SSD to this, you're never going to fill up the cache because the write speeds of the rest of the flash are faster than your read speeds off the other SSD. Now, before we wrap up this overview, there's one other thing I want to mention. There is a higher performance version of this, which is the 960 Pro. While that drive does have higher endurance levels and slightly higher performance in certain use cases compared to this drive, for most people, I would recommend going with the Evo line. The reason for that is that you're very rarely going to see any difference between the two drives, even on very heavy prosumer workloads. The one exception where I might recommend going with the Pro model is if you're using it as a cache in a heavily used server. In that case, you will see some benefit from those increased endurance ratings, as well as I believe it comes with a longer warranty. But for any prosumer, this is really the best storage drive that you can get. Now, it is expensive compared to SATA SSDs, but you're getting a much higher level of performance. The only thing that's going to be faster than this is the yet to be officially released Intel Optane SSDs. However, those are at prices close to $4 per gigabyte, which is much higher than this, and you really don't need that level of performance unless you're looking at displacing RAM in a large memory capacity server or workstation. One other thing to keep in mind when you're looking at purchasing your storage, these NVMe SSDs are still more expensive by a decent margin than a standard SATA SSD. A couple picks that I like for SATA SSDs currently are the Western Digital Blue SSDs and the Samsung 850 Evo SSDs. Both of those hit a significantly lower price point than this, down at about 2/3 to half the price. And for most consumer workloads, you won't even see much of a difference between those and this. The benefit you get for this is really on the prosumer workstation side, where the added throughput is a big benefit. Now, that's not to say that you won't see any difference in typical consumer workloads. You will see faster startup times with this, faster program load times. It really gets to the point where your CPU is your bottleneck, not the storage, which can be a good thing. For a long time with hard drives, that was our main bottleneck, and it's nice to see storage finally getting to the point where it can fully keep up with even a high-end CPU. Alright, before we conclude this video, let's do a final quick close-up of the drive itself. Alright, there's the front of the drive. You can see the M.2 connector on this side. The slot here, where your screw to the motherboard, will hold this firmly in place. This sticker is actually a heat spreader, so do not take that off. Under this side are your two flash dies. Over here is your controller. And the back of this is just an empty PCB. Well, that wraps up this unboxing and overview of the Samsung 960 Evo SSD. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please like and subscribe. Also, I'd like to invite you to check out our custom design systems at triteratech.com, as well as our pre-configured systems on Amazon under the name Triteratech. That's TRITERRATECH. Thank you for watching.